Mick Doohan finally revealed the 5 riders he could never respect. There was a moment at Jerez in May of 1999 when a damp white line ended everything. Mick Doohan's Honda NSR 500 touched it at over 200 kilometers per hour. The rear wheels spun up, and the machine threw him into the Armco at full speed. He broke his wrist, his collarbone, his foot, his hand, his leg, and several ribs before the ambulance reached him. He was 33 years old, chasing a 6th consecutive world title, and that was the last competitive lap he would ever ride. What followed was not grief, it was accounting. Doohan spent the years after retirement doing what he had always done inside a race, assessing, filing, measuring. And when he finally spoke, at 60, about the 5 riders who had occupied a specific and distinct category in his mind across his career, he did not use the language of hatred. He used something colder, more precise. These were not men he despised. They were men who, each in a different way, had failed to meet the standard he considered non-negotiable, and in doing so had cost him something: a title, a clean record, peace of mind, or the conclusion he deserved. To understand which 5, one must first understand the standard itself. Mick Doohan was described by the respected motorsport journalist Matt Oxley as a man who went racing like there were demons chasing him. If he ever slowed down, they'd have him. That is not a compliment dressed up as biography. It is a clinical observation about a psychological condition that happened to produce 5 world championships. Doohan did not race to win. He raced because any state other than total forward motion felt, to him, like the beginning of the end. His chief mechanic, Jeremy Burgess, rebuilt a rear brake system after the 1992 Assen crash destroyed Doohan's ability to use his foot on the pedal, the thumb brake. An entire braking system redesigned around a man who refused to accept that his injury was a reason to change outcomes. When a journalist later suggested he was making Grand Prix racing boring by winning everything, Doohan's response was 4 words. "What do you want me to do? Slow down?" That was not arrogance. That was a man who genuinely did not understand the question. This is the internal architecture one must hold when examining the 5 names. Wayne Rainey is the first and the most misread. The received version of 1992 frames Rainey as a villain, the man who took Doohan's title while he lay in a Dutch hospital. The accurate version is more complicated, and Doohan knew it. Rainey himself, when Doohan didn't show up to race after Assen, said plainly, "When Mick didn't show up, people started to realize how bad his leg was. I was racing against a ghost." That is not the statement of a man celebrating a rival's misfortune. It is the statement of a man who understood that the championship he won was incomplete. And here is the fact that cuts both ways. Doohan lost the 1992 title by 4 points. He missed 4 races. In every other year of that era, the race at which he returned, struggling to 12th on a leg with no feeling below the knee, would have given him 4 points toward the championship. In 1992 alone, they only awarded points to 10th. The margin between Doohan's first world title and his rehabilitation was a single rule that applied to a single season. Doohan did not hate Rainey. What he could not fully resolve was the specific arithmetic of that year, the way circumstance, medical malpractice, and a rulebook anomaly had stacked against him simultaneously, while the title went to the man who simply stayed upright. It was not Rainey's fault. Doohan knew that. But knowing something intellectually and being at peace with it are different conditions. And for a man whose psychology was built entirely around the elimination of variables, That year represented a variable he could never eliminate. By 2022, the two men rode together up the famous Goodwood Hill. Side by side, former rivals turned something the sport calls friends. The accounting had closed, but it had taken 30 years. Kevin Schwantz represents a different category of frustration, not what was taken, but what was never completed. Their rivalry in the late 1980s and early 1990s was the best the 500cc class produced before Doohan's dominance collapsed. The competition entirely. Schwantz was everything Doohan was not publicly: expressive, crowd-beloved, unpredictable, capable of a pass that made grandstands rise. He won the 1993 World Championship in the year Doohan was still rebuilding on a bent leg with half a little toe ground away. Then Schwantz retired in 1994, citing stress and diminished motivation, walking away mid-season after his 25th and final Grand Prix win. At Donington, over Doohan by 2 seconds. That was the last time they raced at full competitive strength against each other. For Doohan, this was not a wound so much as an unresolved equation. The man whose speed had genuinely challenged him, had beaten him on raw pace on the days he rode within his gift, had departed before the final settlement. Doohan spent 1994 onward winning races in which Schwantz was absent. The record shows dominance. What it cannot show is whether that dominance would have held with Schwantz still present, still committed, still circling on those unpredictable days when nobody could match him. Doohan never got to find out. He filed that under incomplete. Alex Crivellet is the rivalry that happened inside the building, and those are always the most corrosive. They shared the Repsol Honda garage from the mid-1990s onward. Same manufacturer, same tires, same race engineer conversations across the pit lane wall. Crivellet had genuine speed, enough to challenge Doohan through multiple seasons, enough to eventually win the 1999 world title in the vacuum Doohan's injury created. That last fact is not incidental. It is the core of the tension. Their most documented collision came at the 1996 Spanish Grand Prix. Fans entered the track prematurely. Crivellet, distracted, crashed at the final corner, and Doohan took the victory. Crivellet's home race, Crivellet's crowd, Crivellet's moment to claim. Gone to the man from Queensland, who had already claimed everything else. The internal war at Honda that followed was documented openly. Crivellet was not willing to spend his career as supporting cast. Doohan was not willing to have a teammate who operated as anything other than secondary priority. What Doohan held against Crivellet was not speed. It was the specific dynamic of a man positioned by circumstance to inherit rather than earn. Crivellet did not beat Doohan to his title. He was handed it by a qualifying crash in Spain in May 1999. Doohan, who had rebuilt from his own near amputation, who had ridden 5 seasons on a permanently damaged leg, who had never once received anything by default, found the mechanism of that succession difficult to process in silence. He mostly processed it in silence anyway. That was his way. Max Biaggi is the clearest case, and Doohan was most explicit about it. Biaggi arrived in the 500cc class in 1998, trailing 4 consecutive 250cc world championships and considerable noise. He won on debut at Suzuka, pole position, fastest lap, victory, and the Italian press announced the heir. By the midpoint of the season, Biaggi actually led the championship standings. 3 points separated the reigning 5-time champion from a rookie in his first Premier Class year. Doohan responded methodically. He won the Dutch TT. He won in Germany. He rebuilt the lead, and when Biaggi was disqualified at the Catalan Grand Prix for ignoring flags, converted the breathing room into a 5th consecutive title. But the manner in which that title was secured, partly through a rival's own undisciplined conduct, was not satisfying to Doohan. He wanted the argument settled on the track. Years later, his assessment was delivered with the precision of a technical debrief. "I don't know how many times we've seen it before with Biaggi. He can win on a Yamaha and he can win on a Honda, and that's all he can do. He can't string anything together. His consistency's not there." This is not the language of personal animosity. It is the language of a man who had set a specific standard, total, relentless, week after week consistency, and was describing with clinical accuracy the failure to meet it. Biaggi could produce brilliance. What he could not produce was the machine-like reliability that Doohan considered the only real measure of a champion. The rest, to Doohan, was just talent. And talent without discipline was interesting, but ultimately insufficient. John Kaczynski is the 5th name, and the most revealing, because it discloses something about the standard itself. Kaczynski was fast, legitimately, undeniably fast. Fast enough to beat Doohan on his best days, fast enough to win on machines well below the Honda's capability. In 1991, on the final podium of the season in Malaysia, Kaczynski won the race. On the podium, Wayne Gardner and Doohan looked at each other simultaneously and sprayed champagne directly at him. Kaczynski ran off the stage. This was not a misunderstanding. This was two senior riders communicating without words that a particular line had been crossed repeatedly, and they had chosen that moment to mark it. What Doohan could not accept about Kaczynski was the exemption. The paddock has always operated with an informal system of accommodations for exceptional talent, a tolerance for eccentricity, for erratic behavior, for the refusal of normal social conventions, because the lap times justify the exception. Doohan found this accommodation philosophically incompatible with the way he understood competitive sport. Speed and professionalism were not, to him, separable categories. A rider who delivered one without the other was not a complete competitor. He was a partial one. This is the thread that runs through all 5 names. Rainey represented the year the variables won. Schwantz represented the account that was never settled. Crivellet represented the man positioned to inherit rather than earn. Biaggi represented talent mistaken for greatness. Kaczynski represented the paddock's willingness to excuse what Doohan considered inexcusable. None of this is hatred. All of it is standard. Mick Doohan spent his entire career operating at a level of internal demand that had no formal name and required no external validation. He rode 5 seasons on a leg that a Dutch surgeon had nearly amputated. He invented a braking system with his thumb because the alternative was not racing, and not racing was not an option he could process. He won 54 races and 5 consecutive championships, and was still at Jerez in 1999, looking for the 6th. Not from greed, but because stopping had never been part of the architecture. The 5 riders he named were not failures. They were, each of them, exceptional by any measure the sport applies. What they were not, and what decades later he could finally articulate, was this: they were not him. And for a man who had built his entire identity around a standard that admitted no variance, that gap was never quite small enough to close. He is 60 now. The accounting is done. The tightrope, of course, broke first.